when I see what these people are doing and they get rewarded for it, I'm like, it's like rewarding my toddler when he throws a tantrum. It begets more tantrums. And they are literally just throwing tantrums. You got to stop it. Like, you got to like say, you know what, this is worth the fight. Like, if you're just going to go along to get along, then you're just a seat warmer. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to run for the Texas House, you're not making any money. And if you're just a seat warmer, you're not making a difference. So you're spending 6 months to lose money, be down in Austin. What? So you have like a nicer title at the political events you go to?
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of even being there if you're not going to stand up for what you believe in, or at the very least, what your constituents actually believe in? We have a great episode today, a great guest, the preeminent reporter, or one of the preeminent reporters in the state of Texas, Robert Downen, a senior writer for Texas Monthly covering religion and politics. Welcome to the show, Robert. How are you today? Or do you prefer Rob?
I prefer my preeminence, Rob. But either way.
The preeminence? Okay, yeah. Whatever. I think we all need more titles like that just to go around.
I agree completely.
Good nicknames, good titles. Like, I think it would make everything involving politics better. Then again, they tried that for a few thousand years, and I'm not sure that's actually the case.
I was going to say, the one thing we need in American politics is for people to feel even more.
Especially if we start handing them down to our children, we inherit it, becomes our... Yeah, it's a whole thing. I guess we'll just kind of dive right into it. You've covered religion and politics and kind of how they meet for a long time in Texas. Kind of talk to you about how you started and where you got to where you're at, kind of in a big picture level.
Sure. I mean, so the longer story is I grew up in an evangelical church, was always kind of fascinated with the study of religion. I, at one point, wanted to be a war correspondent and study, kind of Eastern religions. Then I went to a school where they didn't even have an Arabic program and quickly realized that probably wasn't going to work. So I went with journalism instead. And I'd always been kind of fascinated with, not just religion, but like, I guess the idea of belief, I don't know. I was always very interested in religion, but also very interested in like conspiracy theories and like all these other things that are like, not, kind of their own forms of religion. So that was always just kind of fascinating to me. But, professionally, where it really started was really by accident. I was working at the Houston Chronicle. I had been there for about 4 months, and came across some court documents involving a, prominent Southern Baptist judge named Paul Pressler, and who was also kind of a mini kingmaker amongst the religious right for a number of decades. And I basically came across a sexual assault lawsuit document that kind of, sparked some other questions, which led to this much larger investigation into Southern Baptist abuse that we did at the Chronicle for 6 years. And then that kind of led me into, kind of the reporting that I'm doing more broadly now. So
interesting. You were at the Chronicle, you broke a lot of major stories because you had moved over to the Texas Tribune, and now you're at the Texas Monthly. So you went from a kind of the most traditional big name newspaper here in the state to the big digital statewide, like Texas politics, flagship, now to like the most famous news magazine in the state, but they're all different platforms. They have different, like, kind of their own style guides, but their own niche that they cover, but within the world of Texas politics. How is that kind of morphed with as your writing, as it's changed, but also like, how do you decipher, or how do you decide what story you want to cover now versus when you were on a beat at the Chronicle?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I don't have it is something that I'm learning every day. And I think most journalists are learning every single day. But, when you're at a daily newspaper, like it is not you rarely have the opportunity to kind of pause and think like, oh, I'm going to take 3 or 4 days off and write about, go a little bit deeper on something, because there is just it's a daily newspaper. The newspaper has to be filled every morning. And there are just so many things that are happening that like, demand your attention. Whereas at the Tribune, I had a little bit more of a luxury as far as, I was writing fewer stories. There's not that kind of like expectation that we have to have, 25, 30 new stories a day to fill the newspaper. And then at Texas Monthly, that's been a really different shift because, we are thinking, 2 to 6 to 8 months out, if not a year or two out on some stories. And so it's really a difference of like thinking about a story, one, from the idea of like, is this going to be as compelling and as relevant 2 months from now, 6 months from now as it is today? How do we tell this story through, really through characters? And I think that's one of the big differences too, is like, because there's such an emphasis on character-driven stories, on really telling the story of Texas, there's just a real different kind of like buy-in as far as time and resources for a story. And I think that is, I really loved it, especially with what I cover. Religion is such a deeply complicated thing on a personal to community to societal basis, that like having that room to like spend, 3 or 4 weeks hanging out with one group and telling the story through their eyes is a really helpful lens and an approach to kind of digging into what can be a much thornier subject matter when you're talking about, you have 800 words and 3 hours to churn a story. So
yeah, that's a much different kind of writing too. Like not just a style of writing. Like you end up having more, generally speaking. I'm not speaking to your writing, but magazine writing typically is more literary in its structure and whatever else. You end up hearing more about like the setting of the room someone's in, some like iconic stuff of like just being in a truck, like why did it smell like a fish fry here?
I haven't written my definitive he picked at a plate of yada yada over lunch anecdote yet, but I'll get there one day.
You'll get there, like you get that, then you get that type of setting and, like you said, character. There's no shortage of characters in Texas, but I feel like in a place like Texas Monthly is where that kind of those characters are really fleshed out, which kind of informs what the other folks, people, the writers for the Chronicle or other papers, like can then rely on as kind of just like common knowledge amongst a lot of their readers.
Yeah.
So like,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
I think that there's such a reciprocity between like the different levels of media in this state that's really interesting. Like, we are all kind of, advancing each other's work. The Houston Chronicle, Dallas Morning News, all these dailies are doing just like the true like true work of like just keeping tabs on everything that every day. And then like Texas, the Texas Tribune gets to take a little bit more of a patient, statewide view of something. The kind of one of the, I guess, kind of the ethos of the Tribune is to a certain degree, like, we have to tell a story that relates to, that is something that someone in Midland will read and someone in Beaumont will read. And then Texas Monthly is the same approach, but also kind of taking like, a more like telling the story of to a certain degree too. So it's just slightly different variations of picking up on each other's work. So,
and now, whenever you look back historically, whenever you like someone like you in the future is going back to the archives and looking at, let's say there was an impeachment again, looking back at how this impeachment with Ken Paxton went a couple of years ago versus the Harmillo one in the 70s versus the ones that happened in the 1920s. Like, they're going to look at the dailies, but some of the stuff that, at least historically, that has withstood the test of time far longer has been Texas Monthly in particular, and other quarterly and monthly magazines and anthologies that kind of really do a good job of setting what it was like in that moment. So you're creating a part of history at the same time, or at least a part of the historical record.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that I'm someone who so much of my work is dependent on news archives. Like that is kind of I just love going through archives in general, and it is really interesting too, as someone who does a lot of I'll be writing. My first step with the story often, if I'm writing about someone, is to just go on basically the news archive records and read every single thing I can find about them through 1981 to here, because you find so many little different things when you put them all chronologically, where it's like, oh, you believe this then, you believe this now, like you met this person then, they're important now. But it is actually really it's actually really concerning as I do that, because you'll see the Houston Chronicle in the 1990s had a guy who just covered, XYZ court system and was covering just the daily, little things that now would just there's just not enough resources and room for it in newspapers. And it's so it's really, one of the reasons I love Texas Monthly too is because of that. Like, you are kind of writing with this, there's a certain like aura of like, we are writing the big piece that people are going to revisit 50 years from now when they really want to get a sense of this. But at the same time, I think I really like that, as someone who is very worried about like the lack of these historical records on smaller things that we're losing every single time every time a newspaper does layoffs. So
yeah, and you see it happen periodically, and there's talk that's kind of might be about what's to happen with 4 of the 5 big dailies in Texas being under the same like corporate roof. That there's starting to be some rumblings that may or what will likely or could happen in the short near future. My dad was in town this past weekend, and I get the Sunday paper, and when he came in to visit the grandkid, he picked the paper up, and I took it out, and he was just amazed at how narrow it is now. Because when he was a kid, he was a paper boy, and they used to be a lot wider. And he worked on like the school papers and stuff like that. But
you could get enough weight on these new ones to throw it like an old paper.
I don't know. So somebody does, but it doesn't get very far into my yard.
Put a rock in
and I only get the Sunday.
Okay.
I like the crosswords and stuff and the whatever. But it's just so much narrower now. It's not just the Sunday paper, and it's not particularly thick. And it's one of these things where it's like you just kind of seen it. Like I've seen stuff online where they get narrower and shorter and thinner. Over the years. So it's interesting to see how journalism has thus far over the digital era adapted to being in the digital era, or not adapted. I still think there's still room. I think, and you can correct me, there seems to have been some sort of stabilization in the past 10 years where you're not seeing the mass layoffs as frequently or as often. But part of that just because there were so many mass layoffs, no one ever really went anywhere. So you just lost a ton of good or just a ton of journalists, whatever else. But it seems like there's like a kind of a holding pattern waiting for to do a bunch more fail here soon.
I don't know if I don't have the data in front of me, but just as someone who feels in my soul every time I hear layoffs at any place in the country, like I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily stabilized. I think that there are, it's not as bad as it once was, but like it's still pretty bad. I mean, so, and I think part of that too is, one of the things, the early aughts and really, 20, I don't have a precise kind of bookend for it, but so many newsrooms were panicking, trying to figure out the digital era. And it led to some really creative solutions, like the BuzzFeed model was like something that a lot of people really stuck with, which is the idea of having like a kind of clickbaity, lighthearted, fair website that funds really, really good journalism. And most people don't even know, BuzzFeed News won a Pulitzer one time, and people were like, what do you like?
Yeah. BuzzFeed Ben.
Yeah. And their kind of funding model was something that a lot of people tried to replicate. And then, once everyone has some dumb little website that's full of nonsense, then the perception of news just becomes dumb little website with a lot of nonsense and I think it just kind of wore on people to a certain degree where it lost its novelty. And then there was a big financial response to that too.
There was that, but also a lot of it was relying on Facebook the Facebook algorithm. Sure. And it was just whenever the algorithm switched, it just would kill companies.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't just news. It was a lot of places.
Oh yeah. I mean, like I used to, one of the reasons I'm not really that active on Twitter anymore is that like, it used to be, it was never a huge driver, but like the way that the algorithms work on Twitter, if you post a news article on Twitter these days, like you might as well just go out of your window and like yell the hyperlink out of your window because it's going to get the same amount of traction. Like it's just really a totally different algorithmic environment we're living in.
Yeah, and that's the nature of the beast, I guess. So, kind of shift back to covering the actual politics itself, or religious politics and religion. Kind of what is it like to cover politicians and religious leaders and activists, but who just see reporters and maybe you as the adversary, as the enemy? Like, how is it that you are able to cultivate relationships to create the stories not create the stories, but to, get your pieces written? How do you work that process?
It's a really tricky thing, especially with like the religion aspect. Actually, I'll say this. I think that the politics aspect is actually much harder than the religious aspect. Once, if you were talking to someone who is Christian or something, and they're pretty quickly able to, I think, identify that like you, so to a certain degree, speak their language, and you're coming from a place of a sincere desire to understand their viewpoints, even if you're willing to challenge it a little bit. Whereas the politics, there is, I think, a little bit more of I don't want to say the stakes are higher, but the calculus is different because there are different stakes. And so, it is a lot of, there are a lot of people who just won't talk to me. But however, the kind of, there are always people around that person that will talk to me. There will always, be people who are willing to tell me stuff off the record. It is a much more, it's just, I think a different, the politics versus the religion is just kind of a different information gathering process to a certain extent. One is very, 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 very long conversations. Most of my interviews for a religion story are at least 30 to 45 minutes. And if of that, I'll probably use 2 or 3 sentences. Whereas politics one is a lot of like, I'm getting texts and, just getting kind of looped in on stuff. But yeah, I mean, it does frustrate me though. There are so many stories where I've done where it's just like, I have done everything I can to learn someone's perspective on something. And I feel like if they were willing to have the conversation with me, it would be much less, much different than what they anticipate it would be, and the story would be better. And honestly, they would probably it would be a different story for them as well. But because there's just this natural inclination to assume that we are all going to be dishonest, or that we are immediately writing from a place of I guess, bias, it really just dissuades people and really kind of further exacerbates the problem, because people don't see the politicians they like actually in the story, which they take as a form of bias. And because they take it as a form of bias, there's less incentive for the politician to be involved in the story. Like, it just becomes a kind of feedback loop, and just furthers the divide between, our various political sides, but also their relationship to the media. So.
Yeah, I would also say this as someone who's worked in jobs, obviously in the political sphere and in communications, but also just outside of politics. Like, when you're outside of politics, at most, the most media training or guidance you're going to get is at some point on onboarding, there will be a message that says, don't speak on behalf of the company. If someone tries to speak to you on behalf of the company, refer to them to XYZ department. And that is it. On the political side, there is, please don't leak. Please don't talk about stuff. Please do whatever. There's a thing, like, we know news stories are bad because we're reading it. It's the day to day. So I guess at a certain level, people in the political sphere are just going to be more media, at least media process literate. They might not be very good communicators or anything along those lines, but they at least have a vague understanding, at the very least, of what on the record, off the record, on background mean. At least that's from my experience. So I think that might be a little bit of it too, is they know if it's just a text message, you can't add extra context from other conversation to the story. Like, this is effectively all you have to work with, and that's all they're going to give you, right? Or text message, email, etc.
Well, also, the people who are engaging from a political, lens, like not all of them, but like, again, there's a difference between me doing a story about some church that did something versus like writing about a politician based on things that people who don't like that politician but are close enough to them to tell me things. Like, it's just a different calculus in general. Yeah. And I'm not saying like the media is totally immune from criticism on some of the things that I discussed. Like, we do to a certain degree, I think, exacerbate the problem in some ways. But I think all of us, most journalists I know, are actually pretty decent and nice people who actually would just love to have a conversation with someone, and so you should do that, because it makes us feel happy, and then the stories.
I also think that, I mean, yes, I've known plenty of journalists in my time, and y'all are generally not the evil soul suckers that the people would want to believe. I think part of it is whether it's easy just to blame. It's easy to vilify a whole whatever, just in an attempt to discredit whatever is being said, regardless of its truth or not. If it's untrue, then you're going to do it. But if it is true and you don't want people to actually read and look into it too much, you're going to say it. Like it kind of makes sense. Unfortunately, there's an incentive to say that. I guess there's also incentive on the journalism side to, publish the stuff that's going to get the most clicks or get the most people to buy the paper or buy the news magazine, right? Like there is an incentive there. It might not be a conscious bias or anything like that, but there's going to be the incentive, like you said, the BuzzFeed model with the clicks and the whatever else. Like there's that incentive is like, so the story about kind of just what happened at traffic court isn't going to be as much as the politician who's having an affair or is, doing something, right? The one might be more important than the other, but it's just going to drive stuff and people will see that as bias. And I think the thing is, recognizing that there is bias and what the bias may be is better than saying there is no bias, because of course there's going to be biased people who are just biased.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, all of us have, and I think one of the things that, like, one of the reasons why I think a lot of journalists think of journalism as a craft rather than just like a thing that you go to school for and get a job for is that, like, you learn over time how to, like, not like, I think if you were good at your job, like, consciously over time, you really become much more, I think a lot of journalists are inherently pretty empathetic people, but like you are much more sympathetic and empathetic to the people you write about, because if you're doing your job well, like it's funny that people accuse me of being like some, bleeding heart lib, and it's like, I can't remember the last time I talked to a Democrat first. Like all of my worldview of politics is shaped by Texas Republicans because that's who I'm writing about. And it's just like, and I don't know, it's just, my point being that, like, if you are talking honestly and openly with enough people to be good at your job, then like it should over time, not to say it's going to like, oh, it's going to, you started as some bleeding heart lib and now you're a conservative. I mean, just more so that like you become much less reactionary and much more, understanding of the nuances of the positions of the people you're covering. So.
Well, let's talk a little about nuance on some of the people you're covering. You said you currently cover religion and politics. You were covering a lot of intersection of extremism in the Republican Party of Texas, or people in it, when you were at the Tribune. Most notably, you're the one who broke the story that Nick Fuentes was meeting with folks in some, you could tell more about the specific details because I get fuzzy on them now, but was effectively, I believe, meeting with Defend Texas Liberty, which is a Tim Dunn funded group out of Parker County or West Fort Worth.
Now known as West Fort Worth Management Company.
Yeah, now known as West Fort Worth Management Company. I think that's like the fifth name change, or I could be wrong. Yeah, probably changed again once or twice during the next primary season. Kind of what is that? There's plenty of fractures and there's plenty of sides and wings, or whatever you want to call it, within the conservative and Republican movements in Texas. Like, what's your read on kind of the current balance of power? Because not one group seems to be winning right now, but they've not achieved absolute victory. There's still a bunch of people from the people who used to be in charge. Like, where do you see the balances currently, and how do you think that's going to change over the next primary season? Like, what's your prediction?
I try to not do predictions for a variety of reasons, but I think I would say, it's always really difficult, even writing about this stuff, even saying conservative versus far right, like there are so many, just depending on the lens through which you're looking at something, it can be a totally different story. I would say, I think one of the things that I and my colleagues really noticed in the last legislative session was the degree to which power seems to be in the hands of a certain class of activists who are particularly hardline. The number of lawmakers I talked to who was like, oh yeah, like this bill that I wanted, like this bill will, get me. Well, if I take part in passing this bill, it's going to almost guarantee a primary challenger from me. And part of that is, again, like that is kind of the, that has always been a certain ethos within the Texas GOP, especially over the last 10, 15 years. But like right now, it seems like there are a lot of people who are more scared than ever of what this, not just, and I don't just mean the grassroots writ large. I mean like a specific segment of them that are particularly active, and I think particularly have particularly bought into the idea of an uncompromising politics.
Yes, I have noticed that same phenomenon where for me, I feel like people need to start treating those folks. We come from different worldviews, as you're a reporter and I'm an activist operative in the Republican sphere. So when I see what these people are doing and they get rewarded for it, I'm like, it's like rewarding my toddler when he throws a tantrum. It begets more tantrums. And they are literally just throwing tantrums. You got to stop it. Like, you got to say, you know what, this is worth the fight. Like, if you're just going to go along to get along, then you're just a seat warmer. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to run for the Texas House, you're not making any money. And if you're just a seat warmer, you're not making a difference. So you're spending 6 months to lose money being out in Austin. So you have like a nicer title at the political events you go to? Yeah. Like, what's the point of even being there if you're not going to stand up for what you believe in, or at the very least what your constituents actually believe in?
Go ahead, sorry.
No, you're good.
I was going to say, I mean, how much of that do you kind of think stems from or flows from like this broader, like I go back and forth with this, how we, even describe, like if we're talking about whether or not someone is an effective politician, like there are some people who would be like, oh, this person has passed 0 bills over their 2 years or 2 terms in office, but have quite a Twitter audience. And, really, and like, to some people, that's an ineffective lawmaker. On the other hand, there are whole people who are like, no, that's exactly what I want. I want somebody who's going to gum up the system and be constantly telling me that government is broken and unfixable. I mean, like, how much of that do you think stems from this broader, I think, idea of like government, like antithesis or antipathy towards government itself?
There is always a section of the electorate that is going to vote against incumbents. Mm-hmm. There is an anti-incumbent faction of people. There's a slightly larger group that will always vote for incumbents. There are 2 groups like that, and then everyone else can kind of vacillate back and forth. I think with the case you're talking about, and I'll just say, you may have more than one person in mind. What comes to mind when you described that was Brian Harrison, who hasn't even he's got 1 hearing and he flubbed it miserably.
There's a long line of Brian Harrisons. That was my point.
Right. There is a long line. But I'll use him as an example. He has a large Twitter audience, and I would say he goes onto Twitter and abuses people's ignorance of the political process to make outlandish claims that are at best like just misinterpretations of the truth, but almost in a lot of cases are just outright fabrications, and will go on just to say it, or go on Twitter just to get on BNN or Newsmax with it looks like an idea of getting a Newsmax show. I think that's his ultimate ambition at this point. I think his ultimate ambition was to get back to DC, where he had lived for 10 years as a staffer, as a congressperson, but he lost to Jake Ellzey, and then he just hasn't been able to find a path back there as an elected. I think he's probably going to take the commentator's way out, which is nothing to say there's anything wrong with being a commentator, as this is literally what I'm doing right now. But I think the antipathy feeds into that 10% of the overall electorate. When you get that all into one Twitter feed, it echoes and you can find a large group, whether it's your 10% or whatever else, you're going to rouse up that group, because there's always going to be those people out there who want to say, and look how bad these people are. Look how bad everything is. It feeds their priors. And I don't think that means that means they are not an effective legislator if they're not legislating. If they are actively blocking legislation, I guess to your point of, is passing legislation the only way? No. If you're actively blocking legislation or effectively blocking legislation, then I think you are an effective legislator, or at least effective at what you're trying to do in the legislature.
It's all relative,
yeah. But I think for someone like Harrison in particular, he wasn't even doing that at the end. He was just making noise and pissing everyone off. Even the people who were his friends have said, I've not heard a nice thing about him from anybody. And I've talked to a lot of people on both wings of the party.
He's very bipartisanship in the chamber. I'll say that much.
Yeah, yes, there's been many jokes about that.
But again, there's always been a Brian Harrison, is my point. Like there, it seems symptomatic.
Yeah, but even Stickland was able to kill bills, right?
Sure.
Like Stickland is the one like you would look back to, and he's obviously persona non grata to a certain extent because of the way we talked about earlier with the Fuentes meeting, all this other stuff. He has his own set of problems, but when he was a legislator and he was annoying and he was getting in fights with people on the floor, he was still able to use point of orders to kill things or do stuff in the background. He was killing stuff, and he did get one bill passed in 4 sessions. And it was one that people liked.
Yeah.
Everyone's a good fan of it. He got rid of red light cameras.
Camera the other day, and I was like, I got to call Jonathan. What's going on here?
My understanding is that they can still send the tickets because they have the contracts, but you're under no obligation to pay them if they get you.
Okay.
There's no consequence for not paying it, basically.
I just want an excuse to call Jonathan Stickland. He doesn't pick up my call.
I don't know if he'll take your call, but you should. Yeah. Okay, so with that, we're going to move over now to the Substack episode. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch the rest of the episode, there's a free subscription. The rest of the episode's over on Substack, or you can wait until next Friday, a week from Friday. The episode will be live here then too. Rob, where can people find your writing, and where can they follow you online?
I'm at Texas Monthly, and on Twitter, I'm at Robert Downen _. And if you are a blue skyer, I am just at Robert Downen there. So send me emails, send me tips. I love talking to people, so come talk to me. Everyone
should go and follow Robert at the very least. And if you want to give him tips, feel free to do it. I'm not going to encourage it one way or the other, but thank you so much for joining us. And for those who want to keep hearing the conversation, just go to seeingredpodcast.substack.com. It's flashing across the screen right now. And for those who don't, well, we'll see you next time. All right. Bye, guys.